When a personal computer came to life in the 1980s, one of the first things a user noticed was not the processor, the memory, or the storage drive. It was the screen. A heavy beige monitor sat on the desk, its curved glass face dark for a moment, then suddenly alive with a faint glow. Green letters might appear against black. Later came amber text, then color graphics, icons, menus, games, photographs, and entire digital worlds. For millions of people, the monitor became the face of the computer, the place where invisible calculations turned into something human eyes could understand. Yet the technology behind that glowing screen had begun long before electronic computers, long before television, and even before scientists knew exactly what an electron was. The story begins in the 19th century, when researchers were experimenting with strange glass tubes emptied of most of their air. When high voltage was applied between metal electrodes inside these tubes, mysterious effects appeared. Light seemed to move through the glass. Invisible rays traveled from the negative electrode, called the cathode, toward the opposite side of the tube. Scientists called them cathode rays, but their true nature was still being debated. Some believed they were waves, others suspected they were particles. Whatever they were, they could make certain materials glow when they struck them. In dark laboratories, filled with high-voltage coils, wires, sparks, and fragile glass, researchers were learning that an invisible electrical phenomenon could leave a visible trace. That simple fact would eventually become the foundation of the cathode-ray tube display. One of the physicists fascinated by the possibilities of electricity was Karl Ferdinand Braun. Born in Germany in 1850, Braun became a respected experimental physicist whose work ranged across electrical conduction, crystal behavior, wireless communication, and measurement. He would later share the 1909 Nobel Prize in Physics with Guglielmo Marconi for contributions to wireless telegraphy. But one of Braun's most enduring inventions came earlier, in 1897. At the time, physicists faced a practical problem. Electrical signals could change far faster than many mechanical measuring instruments could respond. A traditional meter depended on physical parts moving in response to current or voltage. That motion took time. If a signal changed too rapidly, a heavy pointer or mechanical recorder could not faithfully follow it. Braun imagined another possibility. Instead of using a moving mechanical needle, why not use a beam inside an evacuated tube? A beam had almost no mechanical inertia. If it could be steered by electric or magnetic forces, it might respond to changes that ordinary instruments could never track. Braun's idea was not to build a television, and certainly not to invent a computer monitor. Personal computers were almost a century away. His goal was scientific measurement, but the method he chose would change the visual language of electronics. In Braun's 1897 apparatus, a cathode ray beam traveled through a glass tube and struck a fluorescent screen at the far end. Where the beam hit, a bright point appeared. Braun then used magnetic fields to deflect the beam, moving the luminous point across the screen. For the first time, an electrical phenomenon could control a visible spot of light in a systematic way. The device became known as the Braun tube, an early form of cathode ray tube, or CRT. It was primitive by the standards of 20th century displays. It could not show photographs, pages of text, or moving images. It did not have the sophisticated electron guns, focusing systems, scanning circuits, or phosphors that later displays would use. Yet the essential concept was already present. Create a beam of electrons, steer it, and make a coated surface glow where that beam lands. Imagine an invisible pen sealed inside a glass vessel. The pen cannot be touched by a hand, but electrical and magnetic forces can move it. Wherever its tip touches the inside of the screen, light appears. That is the basic idea that generations of engineers would refine until it could draw not just a single point or line, but complete images dozens of times every second. To understand why Braun's invention became so important, it helps to see how a mature cathode ray tube works. At the rear of the tube sits an electron gun. A heated cathode releases electrons, and high voltages accelerate them toward the front of the display. A focusing system narrows the stream into a fine beam. Deflection systems then steer that beam horizontally and vertically. At the front of the tube is a screen coated on the inside with phosphorescent material. When electrons strike the phosphor, it emits visible light. If the beam were left in one place, the viewer would see a bright dot, but a display constantly moves the beam. It sweeps across the screen line by line, then returns and repeats the process again and again. The intensity of the beam changes as it moves, controlling the brightness of different points. The eye and brain combine these rapidly refreshed traces into what appears to be a stable image. In color, CRTs, red, green, and blue phosphors work together with carefully controlled electron beams producing the colors required at each location. By the time this technology reached computer monitors, the process happened with remarkable speed and precision. But the road from Braun's laboratory instrument to a desktop display was long. The earliest CRTs were scientific devices, useful because they could reveal electrical activity that otherwise remained invisible. This role gave rise to the oscilloscope. Engineers and physicists could connect an electrical signal to the deflection system and watch a waveform appear on the screen. Instead of guessing how a circuit behaved, they could see voltage rise, fall, oscillate, pulse, or distort in real time. The CRT became an essential instrument for anyone working with electronics. Radio engineers could examine signals. Laboratory researchers could observe fast electrical events. Technicians could diagnose equipment. In this stage of its history, the tube was not entertainment and not computing. It was a window into the behavior of electricity itself. Yet every improvement made for scientific measurement also pushed the technology closer to becoming a general-purpose display. Vacuum techniques improved. Electron guns became more stable, focusing sharpened. Deflection systems became more precise. Fluorescent coatings became brighter and more efficient. Glass manufacturing improved so tubes could survive high voltages and maintain reliable internal vacuums. What had begun as a crude glowing spot became a controllable electronic drawing instrument. The next transformation came when engineers realized that a cathode-ray beam could do more than trace a waveform. It could represent information. Radar provided one of the clearest demonstrations. During the intense development of radar before and during the Second World War, electronic systems detected reflected radio signals from distant objects. Those signals were useful, but human operators needed a way to interpret them quickly. CRT displays became an ideal solution. A screen could show the location, distance, or movement of targets in a visual form. In darkened rooms, operators stared at glowing traces and bright spots, turning invisible radio echoes into decisions. The CRT was no longer just measuring a circuit. It was presenting a changing model of the outside world. Television pushed the same principle even further. Instead of drawing a waveform or showing a radar target, electronic television had to reconstruct complete moving pictures from electrical signals. Engineers developed scanning systems that swept electron beams across phosphor screens at high speed, varying brightness to create images, and eventually using multiple color phosphors to produce full-color pictures. The television industry transformed CRT manufacturing from a specialized laboratory craft into a massive industrial enterprise. Factories learned how to produce large glass envelopes, reliable electron guns, phosphor coatings, high-voltage power supplies, and precise deflection systems at enormous scale. This was crucial for the future of computing. When computers later needed visual displays, they did not have to begin with Braun's 1897 apparatus and reinvent everything from scratch. Decades of progress in oscilloscopes, radar, and television had created a mature family of technologies ready to be adapted. The computer screen was not one sudden invention. It was the result of many lines of engineering converging on a single idea: use electrons to draw information with light. Early electronic computers, however, did not immediately look like the machines people use today. In the 1940s, many computers were enormous systems controlled through switches, punched cards, paper tape, printers, teletypes, and rows of indicator lamps. Users often prepared instructions away from the machine, submitted them, and waited for results. The computer calculated, but it did not necessarily communicate visually in real time. A screen was not yet the natural center of interaction. Even so, CRT technology entered computing surprisingly early, sometimes in ways that had nothing to do with displaying information to a human. One remarkable example was the Williams-Kilburn tube, developed in Britain by Frederick Williams and Tom Kilburn in the late 1940s. Their system used a cathode-ray tube as electronic memory. When the beam struck the tube's surface, it created patterns of electrical charge that could represent binary information. The stored bits were not meant primarily to be viewed as an image. The CRT acted as a fast memory device. This may seem strange today when memory chips contain billions of microscopic semiconductor structures. But at the time, the Williams-Kilburn tube was a major step toward high-speed electronic storage. It demonstrated how flexible the cathode ray principle could be. The same broad technology that made electrical waves visible could also hold digital information. By 1947 and 1948, CRTs were already becoming part of computer architecture, even before the modern computer monitor existed. The more decisive step toward today's screen-based interaction came when computers began operating fast enough to respond directly to people. One of the most important projects was MIT's Whirlwind computer. Developed during the late 1940s and early 1950s, Whirlwind was designed for real-time operation, meaning it could respond rapidly to changing inputs rather than simply processing long batches of calculations. This demanded a different relationship between human and machine. A user needed to see information quickly. Whirlwind employed a computer-controlled CRT display, and researchers experimented with light-sensitive pointing devices that allowed operators to indicate locations directly on the screen. This was revolutionary. The screen was no longer a passive endpoint where a machine occasionally printed information electronically. It could become part of an interactive loop. The computer generated an image. A person looked at the image and made a decision. The person provided new input, and the computer updated the display. That basic cycle now seems obvious because it defines nearly every modern graphical interface. But in the early 1950s, it represented a profound change. The CRT had become more than a laboratory instrument or television screen. It was becoming a language shared by humans and computers. This concept expanded dramatically with the semi-automatic ground environment, better known as SAGE. Built during the Cold War, SAGE was an enormous American air defense system designed to combine radar data, communications, and computer processing. Its computers filled large rooms, and its military purpose was far removed from personal computing. Yet the operator consoles looked surprisingly familiar in one important respect. A person sat in front of a CRT display showing computer-generated information. The screen updated as new data arrived. Operators could use a light gun to select items directly from the display. Behind each console stood a vast technical infrastructure, but at the human level, the experience had begun to resemble a workstation. A screen presented the computer's world, and the human responded through an input device. SAGE demonstrated that visual interaction could be practical on a large scale. It also trained a generation of engineers and users to think of computers not merely as calculating engines, but as systems that could communicate through graphics in real time. By the end of the 1950s and beginning of the 1960s, the idea of interactive computing was spreading into research laboratories and universities. Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-1, introduced around 1960, became one of the most influential machines of this era. Compared with the enormous mainframes and military systems of previous years, the PDP-1 encouraged a more direct, experimental style of programming. A typical system could include a CRT graphical display, giving programmers immediate visual output. At MIT, this capability helped inspire one of the earliest famous computer games, Space War. Two spacecraft appeared on the screen, maneuvering around a central star while players controlled them in real time. The significance went far beyond entertainment. The CRT was now showing a synthetic world generated entirely by a computer, and humans were interacting with that world moment by moment. Earlier, in 1952, Alexander Douglas had created OXO, a tic-tac-toe program for the EDSAC computer, with the game displayed on a CRT. These experiments showed that screens could present symbols, diagrams, games, and changing visual states. A computer display could become a space for thought, play, design, and communication. The path to the personal monitor was becoming clearer. The 1960s and 1970s brought another major step, the video terminal. Large computers were still expensive, so many users did not own a complete computer at their desk. Instead, they worked through terminals connected to a central system. Early terminals often used printers or teletypes, producing every line of output on paper. That method was noisy, slow, and wasteful. A CRT terminal could display information electronically and then erase or update it instantly. Suddenly, the user could type a command, see the result, correct a mistake, scroll through information, and continue working without producing a mountain of paper. The familiar appearance of computing took shape during this period. A dark screen, glowing green or amber characters, rows of monospaced text, and a blinking cursor waiting for the next instruction. Universities, corporations, laboratories, and government offices filled with such terminals. For thousands of programmers, the CRT became inseparable from the experience of computing. They might not own the central machine, but they sat directly in front of its electronic face. This changed expectations. Computers were no longer things that lived only behind locked doors and returned answers on paper. They could be conversational. A person could type, read, think, revise, and respond. The screen turned computing into an ongoing dialogue. When the personal computer revolution began in the 1970s, this culture of screen-based interaction was already well established. Early hobbyist systems, such as the Altair 8800, initially relied on switches and lights or external terminals, but as personal computers became more capable, users demanded easier ways to see what their machines were doing. Some early machines connected to ordinary television sets, because televisions were affordable and already present in many homes. Others used dedicated CRT monitors designed specifically for computer output. Systems such as the Apple II, TRS-80, Commodore computers, and later the IBM PC helped move the monitor from specialized equipment into ordinary offices and homes. A television could display a game or simple text, but dedicated monitors offered advantages that became increasingly important. Computer characters needed to be sharp and legible. Business software required dense text. Programming environments needed stable displays. Graphics required precise control over pixels and timing. As a result, the monitor became a distinct PC component rather than merely a borrowed television screen. A classic personal computer setup of the early 1980s was visually unmistakable. There was a box containing the processor, memory, and drives. A keyboard sat in front. Above or beside the computer stood a CRT monitor, deep and heavy, with a curved glass screen and ventilation slots around the case. When powered on, it often produced a soft electronic hum. The image might take a moment to stabilize. Static could gather dust on the front glass. The display glowed in a way that modern flat panels do not. Yet despite its bulk, the monitor felt magical because it made the computer accessible. The user did not have to understand binary voltages or electronic states. The machine translated those internal processes into letters, numbers, charts, and pictures. The CRT had become the boundary between invisible computation and visible experience. During the 1980s, monitor technology advanced rapidly. Monochrome displays remained common for business and text applications. Green phosphor was popular because it produced bright, readable characters, while amber and white phosphors offered alternatives. At the same time, color graphics became increasingly important. Personal computers began supporting richer display standards. IBM's color graphics adapter brought color to many early PC systems, followed by enhanced graphics adapter and then video graphics array, better known as VGA. Each step improved what users could see. More colors appeared, resolution increased, text became sharper, graphical environments grew more practical, games became more visually sophisticated. Software developers could design interfaces that relied on icons, windows, menus, and mouse pointers rather than text alone. The CRT monitor evolved with these demands. Better electron guns, improved phosphors, refined deflection systems, and more accurate circuitry allowed higher resolutions and faster refresh rates. By the 1990s, a good CRT monitor could display detailed color images and support professional work in design, engineering, publishing, and photography. The rise of graphical user interfaces made the monitor even more central. Systems such as the Macintosh and Microsoft Windows transformed the screen into a visual workspace. Instead of memorizing every command, users could move a pointer, click an icon, drag a window, open a menu, or select an object directly. The screen became a desktop metaphor, a map of files, applications, and tools. This style of computing would have been impossible without a display capable of quickly redrawing complex visual information. The CRT had become so normal that most users rarely considered the strange physics occurring behind the glass. Inside the monitor, electrons accelerated through a vacuum. Magnetic fields bent their path. The beam swept across phosphor thousands of times each second. The apparent stillness of an icon or line of text was actually the product of relentless motion. A picture existed only because the beam returned again and again before the phosphor's glow faded completely from perception. Color CRTs added another layer of complexity. The inside of the screen contained patterns of red, green, and blue phosphors. The display had to ensure that each electron beam struck the correct color elements. Shadow masks, or aperture grille systems, helped guide the beams with extraordinary precision. If alignment was wrong, colors could blur or separate. Engineers had to manage geometry, convergence, brightness, contrast, focus, and high-voltage stability. Users saw a simple picture, but the machine behind that picture was a finely tuned analog electronic system. Professional monitors could be extremely accurate, but they were also large, expensive, and heavy. A high-quality 21-inch CRT could weigh dozens of kilograms and occupy a vast depth behind the screen. The size was not an arbitrary design choice. The electron gun sat behind the display surface and needed physical distance for the beam to spread and reach different parts of the screen at useful angles. As monitors grew wider, they also had to grow deeper and heavier. The thick glass had to withstand atmospheric pressure against the vacuum inside the tube, adding still more weight. These limitations became increasingly noticeable as computers moved into smaller offices and more portable environments. CRTs consumed significant power. They generated heat. They took up valuable desk space. Shipping them was expensive. Large models were difficult to move safely. Engineers could improve the shape, flatten the front glass, refine the electronics, and reduce distortion, but the basic vacuum tube architecture remained physically demanding. The technology that had conquered the 20th century was approaching a practical boundary. At the same time, another display technology was improving rapidly, the liquid crystal display, or LCD. Early LCDs had been used in watches, calculators, portable instruments, and laptop computers, but for years they struggled to match the size, color, response, and price of desktop CRT monitors. During the 1990s and early 2000s, that balance changed. Manufacturing improved. Active matrix LCDs became brighter, sharper, and more responsive. Panel sizes grew. Costs fell. A flat panel monitor could provide a large viewing area without requiring the deep glass body of a CRT. It was lighter, thinner, easier to ship, and consumed less power. The transition happened gradually, then quickly. Offices that once contained rows of bulky CRTs began replacing them with thin LCD panels. Home users discovered how much desk space they could recover. Laptop screens demonstrated the convenience of flat displays. Retail shelves shifted. Manufacturers reduced CRT production. By the 2000s, flat panel monitors had become the standard for most new computers. The CRT did not disappear overnight, and many users continued to value it for color quality, motion clarity, or specialized applications, but its era of dominance was ending. After more than a century of development from Braun's first glowing tube, the technology that had defined electronic viewing for generations was being replaced. Yet calling the CRT obsolete misses the scale of what it achieved. It was one of the most important visual technologies of the 20th century. It helped scientists see signals too fast from mechanical instruments. It helped radar operators visualize invisible echoes. It carried television into homes. It became part of early computer memory. It allowed pioneering computers such as Whirlwind to communicate visually. It helped Sage operators interact with real-time data. It gave programmers at machines like the PDP-1 a graphical space for experimentation. It powered the terminals through which generations learned to program. Then it became the screen of the personal computer, the surface on which millions of people first encountered digital text, graphics, games, and graphical interfaces. Every stage transformed the meaning of the screen. Braun's 1897 instrument was designed to measure electricity. By the end of the 20th century, its technological descendants were displaying entire virtual worlds. Karl Ferdinand Braun himself never saw this outcome. When he built his tube, there were no electronic computers in the modern sense. There were no microprocessors, no desktop workstations, no graphics cards, no digital games, and no graphical operating systems. His invention belonged to an age of experimental physics, where understanding cathode rays was still part of a larger effort to understand matter and electricity. Braun's contribution was not that he predicted the computer monitor. It was that he demonstrated an extraordinarily powerful principle. An electrically controlled beam could be used to create visible information on a fluorescent surface. Later engineers changed almost everything around that principle. They improved electron sources, focusing, scanning, deflection, phosphors, color, synchronization, control circuitry, and manufacturing. They adapted CRTs for oscilloscopes, radar, television, terminals, and computers. The modern monitor was therefore not the invention of one person, but the result of a long chain of discoveries. Braun's work sits near the beginning of that chain. The story also reveals something important about technological history. Many inventions achieve their greatest impact in applications their creators never intended. Braun wanted to measure electrical signals. His tube eventually helped computers speak visually to humans. The researchers who built radar displays were solving military and navigation problems, yet their work improved electronic display methods. Television manufacturers were trying to deliver moving pictures to households, but the production techniques they developed later benefited computer monitors. Computer pioneers used CRTs for memory and real-time control. Then programmers turned them into spaces for games and graphics. Each generation inherited a tool, modified it, and discovered a new purpose. Consider the contrast between Braun's laboratory in 1897 and a desktop computer in 1995. In Braun's room, a single glowing point on a glass screen represented a scientific breakthrough. In the computer user's room, nearly a century later, millions of colored points formed windows, photographs, charts, menus, and animated scenes. The physical scale of the tube had changed. The control systems had become vastly more sophisticated, and digital electronics could command the beam with extraordinary precision. Yet, at the deepest level, both devices depended on the same visual transformation. Invisible electrical activity became visible light. That is why the CRT belongs not only to the history of television, but also to the history of human-computer interaction. Without screens, computers would still calculate. They could still store information, process instructions, and communicate through other means. But the personal computer revolution would have looked very different. A monitor gave ordinary people immediate access to the machine's internal state. It made programming easier to follow. It made word processing intuitive. It allowed spreadsheets to become visual grids. It made graphics software possible. It gave video games a world in which to exist. It made the mouse useful as a pointing device. It allowed graphical interfaces to replace many command line interactions. The screen did not simply display the computer's work. It changed what people expected a computer to be. Today, the typical monitor is an LCD, or another flat panel technology. There is no electron gun firing through a deep, evacuated glass tube. There is no sweeping beam tracing lines across phosphor in the traditional CRT sense. The physics is different. The hardware is thinner, lighter, more efficient, and capable of resolutions Braun could never have imagined. Yet the cultural role of the display remains the same. We still sit in front of a luminous rectangle and expect a machine to reveal its invisible calculations visually. Whether we are editing a document, watching a film, designing a building, analyzing scientific data, playing a game, or talking to someone across the world, the display remains the boundary where digital information becomes human experience. That boundary has roots in a small laboratory instrument from 1897. Karl Ferdinand Braun did not invent the modern PC monitor, and It would be historically misleading to say that he did. What he created was something more fundamental, one of the earliest practical cathode-ray display instruments, a device that could steer an invisible beam toward a fluorescent screen and make electricity visible. Over the following century, countless engineers transformed that principle into oscilloscopes, radar screens, televisions, computer terminals, and finally the bulky monitors that defined the first decades of personal computing. The CRT eventually vanished from most desks, but its legacy did not. It taught generations of engineers how electronic systems could communicate visually. It helped establish the screen as the natural face of the computer. And it turned one of the strangest experiments of 19th century physics into a technology that shaped the daily lives of billions of people. The next time an old CRT monitor appears in a photograph, museum, workshop, or forgotten storage room, it may look like nothing more than a heavy relic from an outdated age. Its curved glass, deep cabinet, and faded plastic seem far removed from modern computing. But inside that awkward machine is the final chapter of a story that began before the computer itself. It begins with scientists watching mysterious rays inside evacuated glass. It passes through Braun's glowing point, the oscilloscope, radar, television, early electronic memory, military command centers, university laboratories, interactive games, video terminals, and the first personal computers. For almost a century, the cathode ray tube carried electronic information into human vision. Braun began by trying to see electricity. Generations later, people were using descendants of his invention to see the digital world. The glass tube disappeared, but the idea it helped establish became permanent. If a computer is going to become truly personal, it must have a way to show us what it knows.